Across 5 Aprils, Chapter 2. It was nearly dark by the time all the men were in the fields and the evening chores done. Jethro lowered a tin bucket into the well at the edge of the barn lot and hauled it up clear. Cold water for the thirsty horses. Then, when the chores were finished, he joined the men who were washing the dust from their faces at the big iron kettle that stood at the side of the well. The two older brothers and Will Scrim talked as they splashed in the cold water. Jethro could sense the pleasure they felt in seeing one another again after the lapse for several years. In the kitchen, Jenny and Nancy hurried about getting the company's supper ready. A couple of chickens had dressed hastily and thrown into the pot. Sweet potatoes were set to bake in the hot ashes, and dried apples were cooked in a syrup of wild honey, and then topped with thick cream from one of the crocks in the spring house. Nancy made a flat cake of white flour with a sprinkling of sugar on top, and Jenny pulled tender radishes and onions from their garden to give the taste of spring to their meal. A coal oil lamp was lighted and placed in the middle of the table. When supper was at last ready, gold light filled the kitchen, pouring from the open fireplace and from the sparkling lamp chimney. Black shadows hung in the adjoining room, where the bed had been spread with Ellen's newest quilt and the pillows dressed in fresh covers in honor of the guest. Jethro was sensitive to the color and contrast. The memory of the golden kitchen and the velvet shadows of the room beyond was firmly stamped in his mind. At the table, the talk for a while was of family affairs. There had been a death of someone in Kentucky who was only a name to Jethro, but the name that brought a shadow to his mother's face. There were reports of weddings and births or tragedies, and now, then a happy note of good fortune. Then the conversation began to turn. Slowly and inevitably, the troubles of the nation began to move into the crowded little kitchen. Will Kentucky succeed, Wills? Matthew Creighton asked finally, his eyes on his plate. Maybe, Uncle Matt, maybe it will. And how will southern Illinois feel about it in case that happens? No one answered. Wills took a drink of water and then, setting the glass down, twirled it a few times between his thumb and fingers. It will come hard for the river states if Missouri and Kentucky join up on the Confederacy. Old Mississippi won't be the safest place for North shipping down to the Gulf. That's true, Wills. That's in the minds of a lot of us, Matthew said quietly. Bill's eyes were fixed on the yellow light around the lamp chimney. John was studying his cousin's face. As for southern Illinois, Wills continued, you folks err closer by a lot to the folks of Missouri and Kentucky than you are to the bigwigs up in Chicago and northern Illinois. You're southern folks down here. We're from Kentucky, as you well know, Wills. Our roots err in that state. I'd say that 80% of the folks in this part of the country count Missouri or Kentucky or Tennessee as somewhere being their own. But this separation, Wills, it won't do. We're a union, separate. We're just two weakened, puny pieces, each needing the other. We was a weak, puny country 80-odd years ago when the great-granddaddy of us young uns got mixed up in a rebel fight. Since then, we've grown like weeds in the spring. And what's happened? Well, I'll tell you. A half of the country has grown rich, favored by Providence, but still jealous and fearful that the other half is apt to find good fortune too. Face it, Uncle Matt, the North has become arrogant toward the South. The high-tariff industrialists would sooner heave the South starve than give an inch that might cost them a penny. Then Ellen's voice was heard, timid and a little tumultuous. Farm women didn't enter often into man talk or politics or national affairs. But what about the downtrodden people, Wills? Ain't slavery become more of the fester and hurt each year? Don't we have to make a move against it? Your old Abe from the fair state of Illinois talking out of both sides of his mouth. For the time being, anyway. Wills brought his hand down sharply on the table. What the South wants is the right to live as it sees fit to live without interference. And it can live. Do you think England won't come breaking her neck to help the South in case of war? She ain't going to see her looms starve for cotton because the northern industrials see fit to butt in on a way of life that the South has found good. Believe me, Uncle Matt, the South can fight for years if it need be, till this boy here is a man growed with boys of his own. Young Tom's face was red with anger, but a warning look from his mother kept him quiet. From the far end of the table, however, John's voice came, strained and a little unnatural. "You hedged Ma's question. Cousin Wills, what about the right and wrong of one man owning the body? And sometimes it looks as if the soul, too, of another man." Wills hesitated a moment, his eyes on the plate of food, which he had barely touched during the last few minutes. "I'll say this to you, Cousin John," he said finally. "I own a few slaves, and if I stood before my Maker alongside one of them, I'd have no way to justify the fact that I was master and he was slave. But leaving the final reckoning for the time, let me ask you this. Ain't there been slavery from the beginning of history? Ain't the men that we give honor to, the men that shaped the Constitution of our country, ain't they recognize slavery? Did they see it as festering hurt?" "Some of them did, I reckon," John answered gravely. "I can't help but believe that some of them must not have been comfortable with them words, a particular institution. Well, then, I'll ask you this. If tomorrow every slave in the South had his freedom, come up north, your abolitionists get the crocodile tears sloshed out of their eyes as they could take the black men by the land. How would they say? We'll see that you get good paying work fitted to what you're able to do. We'll see that you're well housed and clothed. We want you to come to our churches and your children to come to our schools. Why, we dang near forget the difference in the colors of our skins because we air so mighty full of brotherly love. Would it be like that in your northern cities, Cousin John? It ain't like that for the masses of white people in our northern cities, nor the southern cities either. And yet there ain't a white man, lean-bellied and hopeless, as many of them are, would change lots with a slave belonging to the kindest master in the South." Then Bill spoke for the first time, his eyes still on the yellow light of the lamp. "Slavery I hate, but it is with us, and with that you should suffer for the evil that brought to our shores ere long dead. That I want us to answer in this year of 1861 is this, John. Does the trouble over slavery come because man's heart is pure above the Mason-Dixon line? Or does slavery throw a shudder over greed and keep that greed from showing up quite so bare and ugly?" Will Scram seemed to leap at Bill's question. "You're right, Cousin Bill. It's greed, not slavery. It's stirring up this trouble. And for human goodness, men's hearts is just as black today as in the Roman times when they nailed slaves to crosses by the hundred and left them to point up a lesson." Matt Creighton shook his head. "Human nature ain't any better one side of the political line than the other. We all know that. But human nature, the all-over picture of it, is better than it was 1,000, 500, or even 100 years ago. There is an awakening inside of us, human decency and responsibility. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't grieve for the children I buried. I wouldn't look forward to the manhood of this youngest one." Jethro felt as if he were bursting with turmoil inside. The thought of war had given him a secret delight only a matter of hours before. It had meant something of the same kind of joy he had known while watching the young men race their horses up and down the road past the cabin on a Sunday afternoon. Or it had meant the kind of excitement that was half terror when, in early days of the school term, he'd watched Shadrach Yale fight a local bully who was trying to break up classes. Jethro had been half beside himself as he watched the young master feint and parry and finally knock his opponent flat on the frozen ground at the schoolyard. For weeks after that, Jethro had practiced secretly at punching an old horse collar, a sack of oats, anything, even the thin air. He had felt his face grow hot with fury. He battered at his imaginary assailant, and he felt strong and satisfied afterwards, as if the fight had sparked some inner reservoir of well-being. War, he had thought, must give men that same feeling of strength and fulfillment. He had sympathized with Tom and Eb, and he had been angered at his father's command for silence when they grew loud and vehement in the demands of war. Suddenly, he was deeply troubled. He groped towards an understanding of something that was far beyond the excitement of guns and shouting men, but he could not find words to define what he felt, and that lack left him in a turmoil of frustration. He wanted to weep, but one endured a lot before he disguised himself in that way. He closed his eyes for a second and swayed a little in his chair. Jenny was at his shoulder then, pouring more milk into a tin cup beside his plate, resting her hand firmly on his arm. He leaned against her for a second and was comforted. Willis Graham was speaking again when the din in Jethro's ears had subsided enough for him to listen. And for every evil that you find for me in the name of slavery, I'll match you in the evil in the name of industrialism. The South asks only to be left alone. Only to be left alone to carry slavery into every new territory, John interrupted harshly. To spread the shame of this land till democracy gets to be a word that only hypocrites can stomach. Bill turned toward his brother, and they have the John Browns and the William Lloyd Garrisons and the Charles Summers for teachers. We're from the South, John. We want men of their kind telling us how we must live. John did not answer. The two brothers looked at one another steadily for long seconds. It was as if they had forgotten all the others at the table, and each was searching the other's face with some pressing need. Tom and Eb squirmed uncomfortably. Willis Graham crumbled a piece of bread. Then Ellen spoke. Her voice was no longer tumultuous. It carried the authoritative note sharpened by long years of mothering a large family. That will be enough, boys. There'll be no more talk of war or the troubles leading to war at this table tonight. The rest of our meal we'll eat as a family that respects one another and honors our company. Willis Graham touched his aunt's hand. I've asked you to pardon, Aunt Ellen. It's been days that I've looked forward to having a meal with you, and I hear I've lost myself in talk that gets me worked up in a loud voice. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't. That's a fact. She smiled at him, gentleness replacing the stern expression in her eyes. You air as welcome here, as much loved as when you was a lad, Wills. I know that all of us is troubled, and are feeling air running high, but for a while here at the table, let's steer away from the hard talk. And so the conversation veered again, awkward and constrained for a while, but it skirted all reference to the troubles of the day. Then they finished eating. They rose and went outside to sit in the dooryard where a soft breeze gave them comfort after the heat of the kitchen. John and Nancy gathered up their two sleepy children and started home. Out on the open road, John turned to call he'd be back later to hear what news might be in the papers Shadrach would be bringing from town. In the kitchen, Jenny patiently turned to the work of cleaning up the supper dishes. Ellen would have helped her, but Bill took his mother by the shoulders and gently pushed her toward the door. You go along, Miss Creighton, he said. Get yourself a little rest. I'll give Jenny a hand tonight, seeing that she's treated us so fine today. Out in the dooryard, the conversation continued to be mild. Exhausted, Jethro curled up beside his father and dove into a silent world of sleep. Matt Creighton smoothed the fair hair back from the boy's forehead, and then, when the air took on a chill, covered him with an old jacket. All the others in the dooryard were tired too that night. Ordinarily, they would long since have been in bed, but the need to hear news of the seeing storm in the east kept them awake. Every ear alert on the sound of wagon wheels from the south, which might mean that Shadrach Yale was returning from a trip to town. Jenny and Bill joined the group after a while. John came back still later. Tom played softly on a mouth organ for a while, but no one had the heart to sing. Jethro was awakened by the general confusion when Shadrach at last drove the team up in front of the yard gate. The boy struggled through a fog of weariness and sleep to go with the others to stand beside the wagon. In the dim starlight, the young master's face looked unfamiliar. Jethro shivered a little. There were no greetings. The family and their guests waited while Shadrach climbed down from the wagon seat. He drew a long breath when he was down and handed the lines to Tom. The Confederates have fired on Fort Sumner, Mr. Creighton. Early Friday morning. I waited till the papers came. They're full of it. He looked wearily from face to face. No one remembered to introduce Willis Graham. What air they saying, Shad? Matt Creighton asked earnestly. How did the thing come to a head? The papers say that Anderson's men at Fort Sumner have been on starvation rations for several days, and that the president warned Governor Pickens of South Carolina of his intention to send provisions to them. He made it clear that it was to be only provisions. The Confederates demanded that Anderson give up the fort and all government property in it. He refused. A Southern general, Beauregard is his name, gave him an hour's warning and then opened fire on Sumner before dawn Friday morning. And Anderson held out for more than 30 hours, then surrendered the fort Saturday afternoon. You mean our man gave in? Tom explained incredulously. Shadrach passed his hand over his eyes wearily. What else could he do? Hungry men can't hold out long. They haven't eaten since Thursday night. More than that, the inside of the fort was in flames. They had to wrap wet clothes over their faces to keep from suffocating. Was there lots of boys bad hurt? Shad? Ellen asked in a tight voice. It's hard to believe, but the papers say no one was killed in the fighting. They say, too, that hundreds of people climbed up the rooftops to watch the fight, as if it was a circus of some kind. And when Anderson's men marched out, the spectators cheered them. Cannon shells for 34 hours, and then cheers when it was over. They can keep their cheers, Carrion said angrily. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get into this war just as quick as I can make it. He glanced defiantly from his uncle to Will Scram, but nobody responded to him. There's strong feelings throughout the country, Shadrach continued. The open fire because provisions are being brought to hungry men? Mister, I like to get a word in right here. Will Scram's voice was stringent with anger. This is exactly what old Abe's been waiting for. Just exactly what he wanted. He worked it so that the Confederates would fire the first round, and he's fixing so that they fired it on hungry men. Well, fine. Now he can sit back and look pious at the states that has been blowing hot and cold. He tugged at the collar of his shirt as if it choked him. Somebody ought to telegraph congratulations to him, he added. Tom glanced at his mother and then leaped into the wagon to drive the tired team into the barn lot. Ab joined him hastily. The rest of the group stood for a moment without speaking, staring at one another from mask-like faces. Finally, Jenny walked over to Shadrach's side. And so now it's war for sure. Is that it, Chad? He hesitated. Congress is not in session, Jenny, and only Congress can declare war. Still, Mr. Lincoln has asked for 75,000 volunteers from the militia of all the states. Not from 7 of them, I guess, Will Graham muttered. It's war, Congress or no. Matt said slowly, ignoring his nephew's remark. He laid his hand on Jethro's shoulder, and his big fingers clutched so tightly that the boy winced. They turned slowly and walked back into the yard. Ellen asked Jenny to find something for Shadrach to eat before he went on down to his place next to the schoolhouse. Jethro sank down on the ground, weak with fatigue and emotion. Someone, he later believed it was Bill, carried him inside and laid him on the corn-struck bed. He woke once late that night and heard some of the men still talking in the dooryard.